Hello, I'm Isaac Kardon, and this is the World Unpacked. Welcome to the World Unpacked. It is really a pleasure to have with us on the podcast today my good friend and colleague Sasha Gabuev, who is director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin, where he leads a renowned team of analysts who were formerly part of the Carnegie Moscow Center, which was unceremoniously shut down in early 2022 by the Russian government. But Sasha is perhaps the world's leading Russian scholar on China and on understanding the Russia-China relationship and on helping us make sense of this really extraordinary new era of great power competition. And it is perhaps at its most acute in the Arctic region, a maritime region that is, in fact, the closest overhead route between all of the great powers, between Russia and the U.S., between China and the U.S., and vice versa, and has been the site of some increasing friction over the last several years. And I want us to just sort of jump right in to this question of why does the Arctic matter to Russia, to China, to the U.S., especially in the midst of so much actual warfare on the European continent, in the Middle East? Why should we care about this remote and sparsely populated region?
Great to be with you, Isaac, on everything that has Carnegie name on it. I'm very discomfortable with the American culture of shameless promotion of colleagues and self-promotion still. But nevertheless, it's always great to partner with you in research and podcasting this time. On your question, I think that if you look at the map and if you look at the global temperature charts and connect the dots, you see what's happening. For Russia, its coastal line in the Arctic is 24,000 kilometers. It controls 53% of the Arctic coastline globally. So it used to be a border of Russia in the north that's covered by a snow and ice wall. So Russia shouldn't care that much about it, minus probably the nuclear strategic aspect, which we'll talk about in a minute. But nevertheless, not that much could happen because the waterways are frozen, and then Russia focused elsewhere, particularly on the European theater, China theater, Central Asia, South Caucasus, all the time sources of risks for Russian defense planners. But Arctics, yes, but not that much. By 2030, we are maybe having the first summer where an ice-class tanker or carrier can go, without being accompanied by icebreakers. By 2050, it's very likely that commercial shipping will be possible year-round, and that could be potentially a pretty busy commercial waterway that invites also a military activity. So for Russia, this climate dynamics coupled with overall worsening of its relationship with the West poses a tremendous security challenge. And this conventional part worries Russian decision makers a lot, started to worry them back in kind of very early years of Putin's rule. I think that around 2007, the Russians started to pay a lot of attention. They passed the new Arctic doctrine. They put emphasis that we should restore the Soviet era military presence there and actually expand that given the new climate trend lines. So that's one. Number two is really the nuclear strategic dimension. Given that right now we are in the era where all of the pillars of traditional arms control are about to collapse, we have one standing still, and that's the START Treaty that puts limitations and introduces verification mechanisms to increase trust and really remove the risks of accidents on both the two largest nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. But this is about to expire next year. Trump and Putin have talked about maybe resuming the talks to update, upgrade, or prolong the treaty. But nothing practical is happening as the time is running out. And Russia has, for now, ceased its obligations, so it doesn't follow the letter of the treaty itself, citing the U.S. non-cooperation and attacks on Russian strategic bombers by Ukraine, which Russia says is enabled by Western intelligence agencies. Anyway, this is about to expire. If we are entering a new period where Russia and the US are not bound by any numerical caps on their missiles, well, then both sides can actually build up their nuclear arsenals. The US is entering into a phase of modernizing its nuclear arsenal, and then the fear on the Russian side is that the US will invest massively into upgrading and expanding its nuclear arsenal, also because it needs to face not only a peer nuclear competitor, Russia, but also an increasingly capable China that's building up and upgrading its arsenal and maybe will reach current US and Russia levels in 5 to 10 years, depending on what metrics you use. So with that, Russia also wants to preempt that and at least expand its infrastructure, radars, and many of the dimensions that are related not to conventional, but to strategic deterrence. And then finally, the Arctic has a lot of untapped potential for oil and gas exploration. It depends how long we're going to live in a hydrocarbon century, but nevertheless, it's likely that these resources will still be worth something. But then the time is running out, so Russia really is desperate to exploit them and bring them to market to earn money. But there's also a source of critical minerals, be it lithium, titanium, rare earths, many other minerals that are both on the seabed and in the regions of the Arctic that are very hard now to commercially exploit. But because you will have access not from land, but from the sea, it will be much easier to mine them and bring them to consumers. And that's, I think, the three dimension, the conventional, the strategic nuclear, and the commercial that drives Russia's interest to the region. I think same applies to the U.S. I think that here the U.S. and Russia are mirroring each other's interests. And then China is a large aspiring superpower that doesn't have any Arctic territories, but definitely sees the Arctic as a huge terrain. It doesn't have this conventional security concerns that Russia has, but it does have the strategic concern because that's definitely one of the routes that you need to think about if you are a nuclear planner for the PRC on how this nuclear exchange with the US might go. And then you're also very interested in tapping into rich natural resources. The downside for China was that it doesn't have an Arctic coastal line. It doesn't have any territories in the Arctic, and the governance of the Arctic up until very recently was exclusive. It was governed by a group of Arctic states called the Arctic Council. China was an observer in the Arctic Council but didn't have any voting rights. Guess what? Now, after 2022, Russia's full-scale unlawful invasion of Ukraine, Russia's membership in the Arctic Council is not fully canceled. Like, Russia is still technically a member, but it's de facto put on ice. And all of the other Arctic states are talking to each other, and the Council is working without Russia. And NATO has incorporated two of the members, Finland and Sweden. So now the Arctic Council is a defunct Russian membership plus 7 NATO member states that are closely working together. And that is an opening gambit for China to get deeper involved in the Arctic, use Russia as its bridge into the region, and deepen its strategic presence. And we can talk about whether Russia is interested to let that happen, but I think that Chinese are very opportunistic on one hand, but also strategic on the other hand, trying to exploit this window of opportunity to put the PRC flag in the Arctic, both in military and economic and in scientific research areas.
Excellent roundup. And I think you've put a whole lot of issues on the table that I hope we'll get to, in particular, the nature of Chinese opportunism, as you stated, and the extent of Russian permissiveness with its 53% of the coastline and sort of dominant capabilities there at present. So before we get there, though, I want to dwell a little bit more on some of the activities early this year from the new Trump administration that inspired us to write a piece recently in Foreign Policy about Trump's Greenland fixation and trying to reorient strategic planning towards the actual concerns about Russian and Chinese collaboration in the Arctic. But what would you say Trump and then Vance in his visit to Greenland were trying to achieve earlier this year? How does their, what I might call a strategic misunderstanding of the theater, how does that help us understand what the real interests are at stake in the Arctic? How does that error clarify what we should be looking at?
I think that if there was a crystal ball at Carnegie Moscow office to look into Trump's head, because we were still there during the first Trump term, we definitely have forgotten it in the Moscow office, so I don't have it in Berlin. So it's very difficult for me to penetrate Trump's brain and to understand I understand the fixation on the Arctic itself for all the reasons we discussed. They're very similar with the Russian concerns about it. Well, the U.S. has less territory, but it definitely has presence through Alaska. It has vital commercial and security interests. In previous time, it had very good friends and partners named Canada and Greenland, a Danish territory where they are part of NATO. They have been trusted, loyal allies throughout the Cold War and some of them even before. They have been very attuned to U.S. security needs. They were very instrumental in creating deterrence against the Soviet threat back then. So I understand that with the same climate patterns, rising China, increasingly hostile and aggressive Russia, the need to put more focus on the Arctic is definitely there, particularly since the U.S. seems to be not fully equipped right now with the capabilities that it needs to be a very significant Arctic player. Like, it definitely lags behind in terms of icebreakers and all of the various capabilities that are needed to be a significant Arctic power and create deterrence and conducive security environment for maritime exploration. But alienating the partners that can bring these capabilities to table is definitely counterproductive. And then Trump said that Russia and China are sailing past Greenland and like all of their military activity is out there close to Canada, close to Greenland, and that's why the US needs to get Greenland and maybe even force Canada to join the United States. That's totally misplaced. If we look at Russia, China military activity in the Arctic, the first ever joint naval exercise that was mainly symbolic. It's still important because it's a step in a direction for more interoperability, has been made in September last year, 2024 only. So this is the first exercise of coastal guards, some ships, search and rescue operations, artillery fires, not large at scale, mostly two navies training alongside each other rather with each other. But nevertheless, that's something we haven't seen, and I would not dismiss that as absolutely insignificant. And we also have the strategic flight of nuclear-armed bombers that Russia and China are doing together, including in the Arctic. So that's something that the US should pay attention, but it's definitely happening thousands of miles away from Greenland and Canada. And that's definitely shouldn't be the focus if Russia-China cooperation in the Arctic is a concern, but rather the Bering Strait and parts of the Arctic there. That should be the focus if I'm playing Team America.
Well, I agree with you on this entirely. And of course, we made this argument. And unfortunately, in the podcast medium, it's not all that easy to show you a map of the Arctic, but I highly recommend taking a look at an Arctic projection and recognizing that the geography of the west side of the Arctic and the geography of the east side of the Arctic tell a really important story about what's going on. China and Russia are connected at the on the west coast of the United States, one might say, or the far east of Russia, but the Bering Strait goes right through the right past American and Russian territory, and that's where all of the activity has been. And as a China watcher, I've been tracking China's activities, and some of their most assertive navigation with respect to U.S. territorial seas and straits has also been around Alaska. And so the idea that the strategic focus should be on the other side of the world by Greenland, which, as you rightly note, has been quite a robust and cooperative ally through the Kingdom of Denmark, and of course Canada, tightly integrated into the U.S. NORAD command, as well as our overall defensive posture. It seems like the real problem is right there in our strategic backyard. And I guess the question that leads us to, and you've given us some of the highlights of this Russia-China cooperation, where this leads us is there an emerging China-Russia axis that is going to kind of dominate the U.S. in the Arctic, in part because of our low capacity, in part because of our strategic focus on things that are not the ways that China and Russia are establishing their presence there. So should we think of this relationship between China and Russia in the Arctic as reflecting something like an alliance, an opportunistic convergence, as you may have suggested, or is it something more unstable or more complicated? How should we be looking at this trajectory? What are China and Russia likely to accomplish in their Arctic cooperation?
I think that it's complex, complicated, and contingent, and depends on many variables. One of them is the durability of Russia's confrontation with the West, that I think we are safe to assume is likely to stay there, at least as long Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin. He's in his early 70s, not his late 70s as President Trump. He's Xi Jinping's age mate. He is obsessed with his health and obsessed with confrontation with the West. So as long as he's in charge, this confrontation doesn't go away. And that provides you zero incentives to try to restore this traditional Russian posture of being cooperative in the Arctic Council and in the Arctic domain. Make sure that only Arctic nations govern the Arctic, and non-Arctic players like China are not present. They are at the table, but silent and without any voting rights. And then Russia would have a lot of opportunity to regulate their commercial and military presence in the Arctic domain together with the others. So that is gone, and that's likely to stay the same. The second variable, I think, is Russia's overall dependence on China that goes beyond the Arctic issue. How much of Russia's export revenues and imports and technological imports will depend on China? Before Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, it was about 20% of Russia's trade, even less, that was covered by China. But now China represents 40% of Russian imports and 30% of Russia's export revenue. And these numbers are actually maybe going up if Trump introduces his 100% tariff against Russia's trading partner. Well, Beijing is unlikely to dump Moscow. So if this measure comes through, the dependency on China is set to grow further. And with that leverage that China will have, one of its strategic ambitions is to use this leverage in order to get deeper into the Arctic. So I think that's the second variable of how much Russia will be dependent on China overall, and how much China will want to instrumentalize this dependency in order to get more of the Russian Arctic. And finally, the timeline is also very important. If the Russians really want to monetize the Arctic resources on Putin's watch, and if the US China relationship becomes increasingly adversarial, and China believes that it's okay to bypass US sanctions to do stuff in the Russian segment of Arctic to the commercial benefit to itself, but in return asking Russia for permission to be more present, particularly including the military aspect. That means deeper integration. So bottom line is that Russia, under normal circumstances, if it hadn't been involved in this horrible, non-strategic war that turns out to be a long-term disaster for Russia's strategic interests, making it increasingly dependent on China on Beijing's terms, Russia would be very cautious in calibrating Chinese involvement in the Arctic, and its preference would be to work with the West in order to develop this coastal line and all of the projects, and have allow China to have a stake in it, but be a minority shareholder rather the dominant player. I think as Russia has shut its doors for alternatives, dependence on China is the long-term challenge. I think Russia is still able to dictate the terms, but I would not say, okay, because nothing strategic and earth-shaking has happened over the last 3 years, it will not happen in the future. I think that the pace of Russia's dependency on China is accelerating. Pace of Russia's confrontation with the West is also accelerating as NATO tries to reestablish conventional deterrence, Europe rearms, and Russia reconstitutes its military. The points of friction increase, and so Russia's need to lean on China, which opens further room for China to strategically exploit Russia's weakness in the Arctic. So as much as this is something that's transactional and rather driven by circumstances and Putin's anti-Western obsessions, I think that the nature of challenge is quite strategic, even if the alignment between Russia and China are not very natural.
This is a really lucid way of explaining this. Thank you, Sasha. There's obviously this circumstance where you might consider it the same seabed, different dreams, even for China and Russia. And especially, I think your point about, Russia's preference would be a more hedged position, a more hybridized way of exploiting their oil and gas resources. But back to your earlier point, because of the sanctions regime, because of the pretty precipitous withdrawal of all the big Western and Japanese firms that were involved in Arctic oil and gas and potential critical mineral exploitation, there's this extraordinary and perhaps growing dependence on China. And I'll take the opportunity to play this old American trick that you pointed out of a little bit of self-promotion. But along with your team, I've developed a report on China and the Northern Sea Route. And one of the key top lines there is that there used to be zero LNG flowing over the Russian Arctic and down the Bering Strait and to coastal ports in China for their insatiable energy demand. And now we went from 0 ships in 2014 to 46 last summer, and all reporting now indicates this summer is going to be even higher. And presumably we're not even seeing all of that traffic. As you pointed out, there are lots of reasons why there's a trade-off for Chinese firms in engaging in some of these very capital-intensive investments and trading relationships with Russia. Much of this is occurring on a shadow fleet, and it's very difficult to, I think, come up with a confident estimate of just how much oil and gas is flowing there. But it does seem like, the tides are changing, and the opportunities for Russia to kind of diversify its relationships are waning pretty quickly. Would you say that Russia is on its way to becoming the junior partner in the Arctic, or are its advantages, its geography, its sort of legacy investments, and as you pointed out, its strategic priority on this, likely to make it be able to hold its own?
I think that it's a question of whether Russia wants to develop these resources or not. If it wants to develop them, and if the door to the West remains shut, which is the very likely scenario for the decade to come or even more, then the only partner to do that credibly is China. Because Russia's pot of money that is ready to throw on the problem is diminishing. Russia invests 40% of its budget into its military reconstitution. And it will have growing needs of continuing the war in Ukraine. And even when the war stops, it wants to reconstitute its military, particularly focused on the land forces, not the kind of northern fleet and so on. That will not be the major priority. And then in terms of the money that Russian companies can invest to develop those resources, they will be short of this revenue. So they will need an outside pot of money, and that money can come only from China in the amounts that's needed with all of the geography, proximity of the markets, and so on. And then the second element is technology. Well, Russia has some Arctic-related technology, the icebreakers, the nuclear-powered icebreakers, but it doesn't have the scale and capacity to build modern ships that's needed to serve these lines year-round. It doesn't have the sophisticated drilling equipment. It doesn't have all of the stuff that modern exploration of hydrocarbon resources or critical mineral resources requires. China has them. I give you one example. The most important new project in the Russian Arctic is Arctic LNG 2, developed by Novatek. It was sanctioned by the US. Chinese state-owned companies own 20% in it. And Russia was able to finish it over the last 3 years of the war only because of Chinese technological assistance. LNG from that project is not flowing to China yet, but it's ready to go anytime that China decides it's ready to take it and ignore the sanctions risk. But China, despite the American sanctions, restrictions, and a lot of pressure put by Biden administration, still helped Russia to accomplish that. So if Russia wants to sit on of its Arctic treasure and not develop that, it can do that. But then no development happens, no budget revenues, and so on. If it wants to earn money in the current geopolitical circumstances, China is the only natural partner. And that's where the term that you use, junior partner, comes in play. Then it's China that will be able to shape the environment and increasingly dictate the terms. For now, Russia has the luxury to not allow China to do what it wants. But I think if Russia aims to earn money out of the Arctic, it will be increasingly that China has a say, because China's leverage is only growing over time.
Yeah, and I think just looking at that tendency and that dynamic, one of the elements of Sino-Russian cooperation that we haven't touched on so far is shipbuilding. And as you point out, that's not something that Russia has capacity to do. And of course, extracting oil and gas is not that useful if you don't have a way of bringing it to market. China is that market and will be for the foreseeable future. And we've had some really kind of daring feats of both engineering and subterfuge of getting Chinese power modules out to this LNG 2 project that you mentioned. Everybody thought it was dead in the water without their Japanese and French and other partners, but it turns out that where there's a will, there's a way, and there's a route along the Northern Sea route between China and Russia. And as you pointed out from the outset, it's increasingly navigable, and we're looking at a sort of not too distant future in which it may be free-flowing year-round. And I think this really changes certainly the map of energy security, but I think it's nested in this bigger geopolitical picture which you've painted. You've got an Arctic Council that's now effectively a NATO body, and that's on the west side of the Arctic. That's over by Greenland. That's all the, in particular, critical U.S. allies who I want to turn to next, who are operating there and have some capacity, whereas you have this sucking sound coming from East Asia that's pulling resources now out of the Russian Arctic and seems likely to continue gaining momentum unless there's some radical shift. So turning now with our last couple minutes to what I view as the really prescriptive part of our work together, and also obviously one of the key questions facing Europe and transatlantic relationships now has to do with the extent to which the United States is going to be able to cooperate with its traditional allies here. And it does bear noting, and I'll give you a chance to get into this in some more detail, but a lot of the capacity that the U.S. lacks, certainly a lot of the geography that the U.S. lacks, is resident in U.S. allies who've been very accommodating with U.S. basing access, overflight, etc. So what in your sense is the way, what is the trend now in terms of that U.S., say Canada-Denmark relationship, or maybe more broadly NATO relationship? How should we think about the roles of these other actors and how to bring them to bear in a way that balances growing Chinese and Russian power on the other side of the Arctic?
Again, we don't have a crystal ball to assess what President Trump will do next. I think that rhetorics about getting Greenland or absorbing Canada has gone down significantly over the last couple of months, but it doesn't preclude these topics to pop up again at some point. And senior Danish or Canadian officials I'm talking to, I'm sure that's your experience as well, are very much on their guards. And they say, like, the damage has been done. And well, I think that people are very emotional about it and very affected. They say, oh, it's generational mistrust. I would not jump to that conclusion. I think that people are speaking out of emotions right now. But it might be very difficult to undo and regain trust within this administration and maybe with the coming administrations. It's just very difficult to see that as an aberration or fixation of one person as powerful as the US president. So we'll see what happens, right? But I think that these countries really want to stay loyal to the transatlantic family that's bound by decades of joint training, investment, security planning, bound by the same values, and is really one team rather than two opposite teams. So that's one. Two, I think that some of these countries are trying to find a way how to show utility of their partnership to Trump. And I think that Finnish President Alex Stubb really deserves a lot of praise by utilizing his commendable golf skills, to establish this channel and also to bring along a lot of capabilities that can be utilized to US and Finland's benefits. To the common benefit of NATO. If you're playing this game, I think that this is a smart move. And I think that more leaders will do the same. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney needs to be tough in defending his country and its sovereignty. But at the same time, I think that the US would be rushing through an open door if it seeks more cooperation from these countries. They're really willing to cooperate with the United States, not with Team China, Russia. And then third element here, I think that is the future of the Arctic Council and the governance. And that's a tricky issue because I understand the desire to ostracize Russia and not have to sit with it in any forum. And of course, any public platform will be used for grandstanding and so on. But at the same time, then the risk is that the Arctic Council will cease to exist, and a large country that's impossible to ignore in the Arctic will say, we're setting up an alternative body, and we invite China to be its lawful member and so on. Then the whole architecture of Arctic governance will fall apart, and we have two different standards. I don't think that this is likely, but I think that this is a scenario that decision makers should bear in mind, and navigate that is tricky. I understand all of the rightful indignation and emotionality around the way Russia acts towards its Ukrainian neighbors and overall to European and transatlantic security. But nevertheless, finding the right formula to keep the Arctic Council alive and not to really erode the set of rules that governs that, while at the same time being in competition with Russia-China grouping, I think is important going forward. And also keeping the door open for the future, right? Because I hope that we will avoid war between the great powers. I think that we at Carnegie are very committed to this mission, that deterrence help us to navigate through before these great powers find a way to compete in a more healthy, non-kinetic way, like we do in sports, in baseball or tennis, right? Still kind of is animated by national pride, competing, security, and economic interests, but nevertheless avoids the large catastrophe. And then hopefully some form of common governance like the Arctic Council will help us to guide through and establish some rules of the road for the Arctic competition as well.
Well, that's a hopeful outlook, and I appreciate you articulating some of that positive value of coordination. And you talk about Team Russia, China, euphemistically, but it is obviously a team sport. Russia itself doesn't have the capacity to really exploit and use the Arctic. And similarly, the United States has to rely on its allies and partners to maintain this strategic balance. And yet, I think, what we were responding to in our foreign policy piece is the almost obsessive focus on the great power elements. And in particular, I think a theory that somehow, because there is some friction between China and Russia on access to the Arctic, that, their no limits partnership does have some maybe northern limits. Russia's very jealous of its control over that space. That somehow there's an opportunity for the U.S. to drive a wedge or to peel Russia off. And this is one of those cases that I think people put in the bucket of a potential for quote unquote reverse Kissinger. But what would you say to people who think of this as a good opportunity to kind of work at this seam between the China and Russia relationship where their interests are not exactly aligned? Is that a viable strategy, or what would you say to those thinking in that vein?
I think that the friction between Russia and China and mistrust, particularly on the Russian side, is there, definitely. So there is, in theory, something to exploit. The problem is that Russia's mistrust towards the United States runs much deeper on oh so many levels and is deemed as existential by Vladimir Putin, by many people in the Kremlin, and unfortunately maybe inherited by the next generation of Russian rulers. Who know? But that's a negative scenario that's totally plausible, that the same level of animosity and obsession will be inherited. And unfortunately, war in Ukraine has turned the threat that NATO in theory posed to Russia into something which is very real. Russia is engaged in a proxy fighting. It's trying to annihilate Ukraine de facto, and Ukrainian self-defense, totally justified in line with international law, is enabled by NATO in the United States, which helps Ukraine to conduct offensive operations deep inside Russia or shoot US produced and guided weapons into Russian territory. So if you try to understand the Russian logic, I think this is something that's so much more profound for the existence of Russia, for the survival of the regime. And these differences run so much deeper than any disagreements with China over the Arctic, that if your ability to survive as a great power and as a nation and continue this confrontation with the West till the West is exhausted and wants to settle it on terms acceptable to you, then, being a junior partner to China is a price that the Kremlin is happy to pay. Like, not happy, but is ready to pay in order to stay in this game. That's the perception. So as long as the perception of people in the Kremlin doesn't change, it says like, oh, this horrible war is a self-made disaster that actually diminishes Mother Russia, and we should find a way of accommodation with the West and then modus vivendi with Ukraine and find terms to terminate this war. And that's probably what Trump is seeking, but he's definitely not getting that with Vladimir Putin. So as long as that's the case, and that's very likely to continue, I don't see any ways for NATO or the US to exploit this gap between Russia and China in the Arctic and utilize it in a reverse Kissingerian fashion. And with that, unfortunately, the way forward for the US is also to multiply the forces of its alliance and create really credible deterrence first, because credible deterrence doesn't exist in the Arctic for the time being, right? The military capabilities are in mismatch of what Russia and China can put together in kind of next decade. So you need to get to the same level in terms of your capabilities. And then hopefully from that, as we did in the Cold War, go into more conventional arms control and protocols for safety of maritime passage, underwater cables, and so on. And that's happening against a technological backdrop and rapid climate change that makes this kind of task very challenging and hard, but nevertheless, to me, inevitable in order to keep this confrontation in a place where it's still cold rather than hot. And then final point here, the strategic element to that. If the START treaty just dies, there is nothing to replace that. And both Russia and the US start to build up their arsenals without any guardrails and any limitations. It becomes increasingly risky. So we are not here to talk about the nuclear dimension, but it's definitely how to keep this element alive in some modernized form and hopefully bring China to the table at some point is definitely critical. And I'm happy that the brilliant minds at Carnegie in the nuclear policy program are working hard on that as well.
Yeah, and I imagine they'll be paying more attention to the Arctic as the sea ice melts and this becomes an area for more deployed capabilities in a world that lacks arms control. So not a super happy note to end on, but Sasha, even without your crystal ball, this is some really, really keen insights into geostrategically vital region, and you're helping us understand this story in a little bit less of a cartoonish way that we've been exposed to from the sort of mainstream discourse on this. So we really appreciate it, and it's really a pleasure to be collaborating with you on these questions. It's going to take all of our efforts all around the world to try and make sense of some of the disorder that we're seeing, and it's really a privilege to work with you. So thank you, Sasha. I really enjoyed having you on the show.
That's what Carnegie collaboration is all about. I think that we want to see the world as it is, not as it should be, unfortunately, but that's the must in order to bring it into a safer place where there's more peace and confrontation, competition doesn't take kinetic forms that take away human lives. So we'll definitely be focused on that, and it's great to work with you.
Well, thank you, Sasha. Appreciate having you on, and we will continue the discussion soon. You've been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Heewon Park is our executive producer and audio engineer. I'm Isaac Kardon, Senior Fellow in the Asia Program and the host of this episode of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.